Did you know that there's actually a vaccine that protects from cancer? In fact, there's a vaccine that can basically eliminate the fourth most common cause of cancer in women around the world and one of the leading causes of cancer death, and that's cervical cancer. And the vaccine is the HPV vaccine. So let's get into it. We are talking about the HPV or human papillomavirus vaccine. Now, HPV is a virus that, as the name implies, only affects humans. And it's very common in humans. If you're watching this video, you probably already have it. About 80% of sexually active adults acquire HPV, and this is a sexually transmitted infection, or an STI. It's transmitted mainly through direct genital contact, and the risk of having the virus, whether you're a male or female, is directly related to the number of sexual partners that you've had. Now, the risk does go down with condom use, but condoms don't completely prevent transmission because the virus can also be spread through skin-to-skin contact. Now, there are more than 200 different types of HPVs. And some of those just attack the skin. In fact, they cause warts. Others can attack the oral cavity or the respiratory tract, and in some cases, they cause cancers of the head and neck. But the most problematic types of HPV are the ones that affect the genitals. And unfortunately, those can not only cause genital warts, but they can also lead to genital cancers. And that includes cancers of the anus, the penis, the vulva, and most importantly, the cervix. Now, the cervix is the lower part of the female uterus, which basically connects the uterus to the vagina. HPV is detected in 99.7% of patients with cancer of the cervix, and it's thought to be the cause of that cancer in 95% of cases. So how does a virus cause cancer? Well, it starts by infecting what's called the cervical transformation zone, which is where the tissue transforms from the vagina to the uterus. And once it gets in there, in some cases, rather than being cleared by the body, the virus will take hold as a chronic infection. And within those cells, over time, certain proteins from the virus can induce changes that makes those cells replicate and grow very quickly. And that's a precancerous stage called high-grade dysplasia. Once that happens, it's just a matter of time before that precancerous cell becomes cancerous and breaks through and invades into surrounding tissues. And this process of progression from initial infection to cancer can take about 15 years. Unfortunately, throughout that time, most people have no symptoms, so they have no way of knowing. Now, one of the reasons that cervical cancer rates have fallen so much, particularly in Western countries, is cancer screening. Remember, there's a long period of time between acquiring the virus and the actual cancer. So in that period of time, while the virus is transforming those tissues, if we can identify that precancerous state, that so-called high-grade dysplasia, we can actually catch it early enough to remove it before it becomes cancer. But to identify those abnormal cells, you actually need a sample of cells from the cervix. And that's where the Pap test or the Pap smear comes in. And this is not a new technology. It's something that's been around since the early 1940s, and it hasn't changed a lot. The idea is to go in and directly brush or scrape cells right off the cervix and then analyze them under a microscope. And you can not only look for those precancerous cells in those samples, but you can also look for the virus itself. And this is a test that in this country is recommended every 3 years, typically starting at the age of 25 in women who are sexually active. And if certain abnormalities are found, women then require a closer exam called a colposcopy. And ultimately, if those precancerous changes are seen, then a surgical procedure can be done to remove that part of the cervix or to burn its surface to prevent the cancer from developing. And Pap smear programs have dramatically reduced cervical cancer rates and deaths in countries around the world. But at the end of the day, this kind of screening is secondary prevention. In other words, you already have the virus and you're screening for those precancerous changes, and if you find them, you still have to perform a procedure to prevent the cancer. The better option would be primary prevention, preventing those precancerous changes from ever happening, which you could do by preventing the virus from ever causing the infection. And that's where the vaccine comes in. The first HPV vaccine was approved in Canada in 2006. And these vaccines are designed to protect against the HPV virus types that are most commonly associated with cancer. They use what are called virus-like particles that trigger our immune system to create antibodies against the HPV virus. The vaccine is typically given in 2 doses, though recent studies suggest that 1 dose might actually be enough. And studies show that this vaccine has a long-lasting effect, at least 10 years in current studies. And once you have them, those antibodies are very effective. First of all, they protect against some of those other genital cancers caused by HPV, as well as against genital warts. But most importantly, studies show that women aged 16 to 26 who hadn't had prior HPV infection, who got this vaccine, had nearly 100% protection from developing any cervical disease from the most common cancer-causing types of HPV. We see reductions in abnormal Pap test results, less need for colposcopy, less need for those procedures to remove precancerous tissues, and ultimately in population studies, we see dramatic falls in cervical cancer rates. For example, in the UK, cervical cancer fell by 87% in students who got the vaccine in grade 8 compared to those who didn't. Now, it doesn't protect you once you already have the HPV infection, so the recommendation is to provide the vaccine at that young age before sexual exposure would typically occur. So it's recommended in girls and boys anywhere from 9 to 15 years old. If you're over 26, it's less effective, but catch-up vaccination can be offered at those later ages. And people wonder why the vaccine is recommended for boys when it's intended to reduce cervical cancer. Well, as it turns out, there are multiple benefits to also vaccinating males. First of all, there are cancers that HPV causes in males, including cancer of the penis and cancers of the head and neck, that the vaccine effectively protects them from. It also protects them from genital warts. But on top of that, once you start vaccinating males, you start to develop herd immunity, which means less HPV infections overall, with that benefit then also passing on to women in terms of reducing their chances of getting the virus from a man, and therefore reducing their chances of cervical cancer. So what about side effects? So like most vaccines, it does cause some pain and irritation at the injection site, and there have been rare cases, about 1 in a million, of anaphylaxis due to an allergy to the vaccine. Some adolescents will faint either before or after getting the shot, but that probably has less to do with the specific vaccine and more to do with getting a needle. At this point, hundreds of millions of doses of this vaccine have been administered around the world, and there have been no significant adverse effects that have been found to be caused by the vaccine, including no neurological side effects. And that safety has been established both in the initial studies done before it was licensed and now in many surveillance studies done over almost 20 years since its release. And finally, despite a concern raised by some parents, getting the vaccine has not been associated with increased sexual behavior in young people. So how do you get this vaccine? Right now, every single province and territory in Canada has a publicly funded HPV vaccination program that is part of that routine vaccine schedule. It's given in schools, it can be given in doctors' offices, sexual health clinics, pharmacies, and if you don't fit the publicly covered criteria, you can go and buy the vaccine and have it administered by your doctor or your pharmacist. Now, with school closures and healthcare disruption in general due to COVID, a lot of kids have missed their HPV vaccine, and we need to make sure that they catch up. So we have these amazing tools to reduce cervical cancer. First came the Pap smear, and then came the vaccine. Yet globally, a woman still dies of cervical cancer every 2 minutes, and hundreds of thousands die every year. The World Health Organization has called for a global increase in screening and vaccination with a goal of eliminating cervical cancer by the year 2030. And the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer has challenged Canadians to make us the first country in the world to actually eradicate this cancer. To do that, we need to approach 90% vaccination rates. So if you or your loved one hasn't had the HPV vaccine, particularly if you're 26 or younger, male or female, talk to your doctor and get yourself protected. For more on health and science, subscribe to the feed.